Okay.
Hello, everyone. A couple minutes early.
Yeah, we're just getting everything all ready for you. I know there were some storms across the country last night, so hope everybody's got power. We didn't lose it, fortunately.
Hope you're safe.
Good. Yeah, we're actually in Michigan today, and hope that everybody is having a leisurely Saturday morning. We normally, we have in past years, have elaborate April Fool's pranks. We do not have. I feel I'll just tell you that.
Put it right out there.
We had a few too many things going on to manage an
that's
elaborate prank. Yes, you can enjoy last year's April 1st, Quilts First, if you would like a giggle, but let us know if you're here.
And happy April.
Yes, exactly.
It's really nice to have spring where we are, just around the corner, with the first daffodils and the crocus are blooming.
Yes.
So that's a good feeling.
And good morning, Oregon. How are you? We're going to talk about quilting, specifically our approach to quilting, which honestly I'm a little bit nervous about sharing because it's very different from what everybody else does.
I'm never nervous about this. We just like to put out how we think and do things, knowing that for some of you it works and it's a new way of thinking, and for others it may not work, and that's fine.
But it's the opposite of what most people do. So
yeah, we definitely have a different approach, and
it may or may not be helpful to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to think that it will be helpful, not because it means that you will do what we do, but it will, I think, at least affect the way you think about your quilting choices.
That's true. And it gives you options. Exactly.
So with quilting, it's one of the questions that we're asked all the time is, and we've talked about it on many Quilts First, but with usually in a little more specific way or general way, we're often asked, how do we decide how we're going to quilt our quilts? And so what we've done today is prepared, 4 or 5 case studies where we're going to show you specific quilts and walk you through the decision making we've done with that. And while we both think this through together all the time, we're going to kind of take turns on the case studies. Right. And so Weeks is going to
kick off. So for many of you, it's the first time since we've seen you since our big, Modern Quilt,
the mystery
quilt reveal. So thank you for all of those of you who submitted your images for the gallery. That was super exciting to see. And great job on all of your quilts. It was just fantastic.
You all blew us away.
Yeah.
And if you haven't yet done it, if you go to our website on modernquiltstudio.com, there is a dedicated page that's a gallery of quilts from the Modern Mystery Quilt 2023. And
as of March 15th.
Actually, as of, I think, last week. I continuously...
you updated it?
I updated almost every week.
Okay, I didn't know that.
We're so busy, we don't even talk about
we didn't talk about that,
But many of you are still finishing your quilts. So every week I'm adding 3-7 new quilts. So if you have uploaded yours and you're looking for it, they add on at the end. Now that there are a couple hundred, you really have to scroll. But it was awesome seeing the variety, the creativity, and Weeks and I both had to say, you did a good job at photographing these. I mean, it's hard. It's a big quilt, and we get that it's awkward.
Yes.
And yet the photographs just, it's also because phones are so good these days. You had a lot of good pictures.
No, but the lighting and everything. Yeah. So we've got Canada, we've got Germany, everybody's ready to go.
So the reason she brought up the mystery quilt is all you.
We're going to start talking about our approach to the mystery quilt. So we did the first version of the options that were shown. And so in order to explain to you, because it's really hard to hold up the quilt to the camera and everything, what we did was diagram, and Bill is going to diagram other quilts, diagram how we saw the quilt and how we approached the quilting. And this is going to be shocking to you because I think the first thing to talk about is that I think it's worth mentioning that the predominant approach to quilting in the quilting world is to use the seams as lines in which you draw inside.
Yeah, and those seams could be the seams of the block or the seams of the piecing within the block.
Right.
Basically, the structure of how a quilt is pieced often becomes the structure of how it's quilted or how the quilting responds. And
So go ahead.
I just want to start by saying we're going to show our way of doing it, which is not to say that the other ways aren't good.
Yeah.
This is really
This is just
important.
another option.
And I'm actually also going to encourage you after this Quilts First, I'd encourage you to look at the gallery of the modern mystery quilts on our website, and you will see a couple hundred different ways of quilting the same quilt.
Exactly. Or actually, there were lots of different quilts, but
Different variations.
So just to kind of make sure we're talking about the same thing, what the way most people approach quilting is that like they would make a decision, either they would do an all over with long armers we refer to as edge to edge quilting pattern, with everything is the same, or they would they would make decisions about each individual block, and sometimes even subdivide the individual block and make decisions about that. Go ahead.
I was just saying, often people refer to that as custom quilting, where block by block different motifs are selected.
And then if you had a quilt like our Kumihimo quilt, for example, that people would approach the background, the other option would be there would be this background and then there would be the piecing here. And so generally that's the approach that people have, that you either go inside the lines or you do edge to edge, and that's pretty much it. So our approach is really different, which is that we make decisions quilt by quilt based on the texture that we want, but also the idea that sometimes you want to work within a line and sometimes you want to violate the grid, is the design terminology, which means not have everything. It becomes very rigid when you have the piecing for a quilt and like you've already got the rigidity set up by the grid of the blocks. But then if you go in and reinforce that by quilting each one as each block individually, then you're further separating the each block from each other, as opposed to the approach that we took, which is this is the diagram. So this is what basically what we've done is take that photograph and print out, and we're reverse engineering this.
Yeah.
This was done in our heads while we were planning the quilting. But in order to explain what was in our heads, we've kind of gone backward and looked at how we divided the quilt into modules. So go ahead.
I was going to say, and we realize that we're trying to be low tech here with printouts. Yeah. If you need to refer to this later, you can go back and watch it again on Facebook. But I will say that
or YouTube.
Facebook records Facebook Lives at a lower resolution. We upload it later in the day to our YouTube channel at about double the resolution. So if there's ever detail that you see in a Facebook Live that's a little hard to see, please check the YouTube version of it later, because we record that on a separate device and it will have better resolution.
So I only marked the top part because it would just be harder to see with this darker area. But what I want you to see as I hold this closer is that what I've done is divided up I did this all improvisationally as I was going. So I didn't mark anything on the quilt, but you certainly can if that would be helpful, because we've just got hundreds of quilts under our belts at this point, and 24, 25 years of long arming. So, but what I wanted to do was show you that what we were looking for here was a texture, and we wanted a texture. Can you see that the modules that I set up for the quilting are not the same modules that are created by the piecing? And the idea is that we're having, at least in the top portion of the quilt, we wanted an overlay that instead of separating each block, we wanted to have all of the blocks look as though they are united by one overall texture. So in this particular, we're kind of casually referring to this as modules. So the arrows that you're seeing there are the direction of the stitching. And it's kind of like, if you think of a deconstructed basket weave, that's very loose and very intentional to have variations of vertical and horizontal stitching.
And just to clarify, the lines refer to the fact that the quilting that Weeks did on this was straight lines that were, or I should say straightish. We don't use rulers. Yeah. This isn't with a stitch regulator. It's basically, if you see a horizontal arrow, she went across, down, across, down, across, down. And basically, if you magnified any of those modules, you would get that sense of just straight lines predominantly in the direction of the arrow.
So this is also kind of the opposite of stitching in the ditch, which, like, the concept of stitching in the ditch is to outline every block or every shape or whatever. And this is the opposite, which is that you see where those black lines are. There were no actual lines that defined it. It was just where I turned around. So let me get this here. So for example, right here, let me use my pen, that would be better. And I didn't quilt a black line here.
There we go. Just shaking. Got it.
I went here, back, here, back, here, back, here, back. And so the edge here was defined by where I turned around. And then the same thing, that the bottom edge here was referred to, was clear by where I turned around up here. So the idea is that within these blocks, we didn't want to differentiate between the blocks. However, we did want to differentiate at this line here, because that was like a visually more important line. And we were going to need to, we decided to change thread colors. So when I came down here, went down there, hit that edge, went along the curve, and then back horizontal, and then back. So it would be helpful for me to know at this point whether or not you're following what we're talking about, because I don't want to go any farther if this isn't clear. But we repeated, or I guess since I quilted this one, I repeated this strategy down below with a different color thread using the same module method. Okay, so very clear. Good. So you can see that this is a really different approach. But I think what I really like about this is that it looks good on the back of the quilt because our quilts are functional, and it gives you something to be able to do on a domestic machine that's very manageable. And so we did this on a long arm going left to right. But if you were doing it on a domestic machine, you could start in the middle and work within a module, and in that case you might want to chalk out your modules. And the modules, they can be any size you want. I wanted them to be at least, like, I think we decided we wanted them to cross the seam line. That was the consistent thing. And so most of them are about 1.5 blocks or so big.
To 3 blocks.
Yeah.
The idea was they were all larger than a single block, so it was going to cross the lines. And I think that it's a really important question, because those modules are determined in response to the size of the blocks of the quilt. And I think that, the question that popped up in the chat was how far apart were the lines within the modules units. And we tend to quilt a little more densely than many people, but
not matchstick.
Not matchstick. We do about 3/8 of an inch.
Typically about 3 to 5/8 of an inch for us is where we get a nice drape. So we're not quilting for quilt show judges who love that 1/4 inch apart. That it yields a stiffer quilt, and it's not a drape we like. So we tend to go kind of 3/8 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch. And with the question of, are you burying your thread after each module? No, I'm not stopping. I'm just going from module to module. Go through an entire bobbin.
Continuous line.
It's all nonstop. So you just go from one to the other. And the secret of quilting, and I remember I had a conversation with, I don't know where we were, but with Angela Walters about it. She said, it's just knowing where you're going. Everything is about just knowing where you're going.
It's strategy.
Yeah, it is. And so the continuous line means like you're going through that entire bobbin. But what I love about this for beginners also is that you can't really mess up.
This can't be underestimated, the importance of this.
Yeah, I'm really delighted, Nancy, you're saying that this is a great way to quilt on a domestic machine. This is why we did it, because there are lots of people out there who like want people to quilt with rulers and they're like make it look like a machine has done it. I really want you to have something that's manageable and functional and attractive that you can do on your domestic machine. And I feel like this module method is
it's freeing.
Yeah, I feel, but it's not just, it's so flexible, and you can scale it depending on the size of the pieces. You could use this if you wanted a background, if you had a lot of negative space in a quilt, and you wanted just to do this kind of deconstructed basket weave sort of idea on a background, it would be great. Well, we have one more example of this, but
and I actually, can I jump in for a second? Because one of the things is we talk about straight lines and working on a domestic machine or a long arm, something to really clarify. We said we don't use rulers. If you're on a domestic machine, you can do straight lines by dropping your feed dogs, and there's straightish. You kind of go,
but you can do
back
any
and
module that works
forth.
for you.
A lot of people think straight line quilting equals walking foot quilting. And the reality is then you go forward, you've got to turn your whole quilt, you've got to bring it back. So if you have a machine on which you can drop your feed dogs, you can still do straight line quilting. And actually that more closely approximates how we use our long arm, because we do have a long arm that allows you to use an electromagnet to lock in perfectly straight lines, or turn on a stitch regulator so every stitch is the same length. I don't think we've ever used either feature. We want the looseness.
But I also think we found, like, when we tried it, it just didn't feel like it was a natural pace for us. But, hand quilting, Kathy Ann's point about, this is also an interesting way to think about hand quilting as well. Because it gives you the flexibility within a hoop to kind of figure out how you're going to stitch within a hoop without, you can make a smaller module or whatever. But you don't have to be worried about being precise. It's like handwriting that's consistent. You just want consistent. Yeah.
And another thing, I'd like to revisit that question of how far apart is your quilting. And we'll talk about it in a couple other case studies. But the space between lines of quilting is determined by several things. One, what batting you're using. We'll talk more about that later. The aesthetics, what you like, but also the size of the pieces in the quilt itself. So the modern mystery quilt, when it's easier to see in color, most of the piecing in it was at least, I'd say, 1.5 inches finished. There were a couple things that were an inch finished, but nothing was a little sliver. And it's important to us that when you're doing lines, that you have enough density that every single piece gets quilted. So if the narrowest piece is 1 inch wide, we probably want to have at least 3/8 between lines, just so no one piece avoids getting quilted and getting too poofy or popping out.
But actually for me, I think, I would say the farthest we've ever gone is probably like 3/4 of an inch, because we're looking for a texture and a drape. So we're not, we have very specific goals for our quilts. Even if it's a wall hanging, I don't want that super stiff quilting. I just don't like it.
Personal,
but it's totally taste. If you like it, go for it.
And it's also time. How much time you have to put into it, because we never quilt a quilt, say 2 inches apart, even though the Quilter's Dream batting we use says you can quilt 8 inches apart. I don't want to do that because even if it's 2 inches apart, when it washes, it gets very loose, and a lot more stress is put on those seams and on that fabric when it's looser. So I think quilts wear better when they're a little more held down, especially, at least for us, we wash and dry our quilts all the time. And we use them.
And for me, I'm not so much concerned about the wear as I am about the texture. And it goes, for me, like bigger than 3/4, gets wrinkly. And there's a difference between crinkle and wrinkle. And so what we found over the hundreds and hundreds of quilts we've made is that if it's too loose, the quilt can get wrinkly, and the piecing just can look a little messier than it should. And if it's too tight, then it gets too stiff. So through our own trial and error, we have figured out what works for the Quilter's Dream batting that we use.
Exactly.
However, and we're going to get to questions for sure, but there was, while we're on this topic, somebody said, when they're looking at batting, that there is a stitch up to X inches apart on every roll of batting. And they're saying like, well, how much can you get away with? Don't try to get away with anything, because when it says stitch up to, Quilter's Dream is really unusual at being like 8 inches apart in some cases, but I know a lot of the other battings will say 1.5 inches apart or 3 inches apart. They're telling you that if you have your stitching lines farther apart than that the batting might not hold up over time.
It might shift and clump.
Right. So you really don't want to test that.
Yeah, obey that. That's a limit,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that it needs to be that far apart.
No.
It can be much closer, but don't...
And you probably want it to be
Don't
closer.
ever exceed that and expect good things to happen.
Yeah, because they want to be able to tell you the maximum.
I actually think that's often especially important if you're going to tie a quilt.
Oh, well, tying is a whole different thing.
We won't get into that right now.
But tying, there are certain battings you just plain don't want to use unless it says it's appropriate for tying,
because it will pull
then
apart.
Then you'll really have problems. Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is move into another case study to show you a different quilt. This is our fadeaway quilt. And what issue was this?
I think it was 6, I want to say.
I think
it's Modern Quilts Illustrated.
It was in Modern Quilts Illustrated.
But you can look on our pattern finder if you need to find it.
And this is a quilt that is one of our kind of napping sizes, roughly 4 feet by 6 feet. And we tend to think through the quilting before we piece the quilt, because for us it's part of the design of the whole thing. But I did want to kind of analyze. We're always kind of trying to analyze and break things down. So when we designed this, if you look at the structure of the quilt, there are 2 things happening. You're going from low density to higher density. Basically, this is breaking apart as it goes up. So there are fewer colored blocks at the top of the quilt. So that's one sense of movement. The other is it's going from one side to the other, from blues and greens to oranges, yellows, reds. But I'm going to get closer.
But there's also an ombre going from top.
Yeah, so there's a light to dark ombre from top to bottom. There's a density, and then there's a hue shift. But if you look closely, you'll see that this isn't about exact. It's not like a watercolor quilt where you go light, medium, dark. If you notice, some of the pinks have tiptoed into the blues. Some of the lights have gone down further into the darks. So we were trying to create almost a lava lamp-like feeling that this is a moment in time, that it's continuously moving. So that thinking made us approach the quilting a little differently, because we thought, now there's so much movement and we want people to think and feel that movement. So we carried that over into quilting.
Hold on, I'm going to put this.
Okay, we've got all these big printouts that we have to juggle.
Put this underneath because it bleeds through.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to mark on this.
So Bill is going to...
So what I've done is I've done a black and white version of each of these just because it's a little easier to see a marker. So what we knew is visually there was kind of a left to right visual. There was also a top to bottom. So for some people that might imply, oh, quilted in a grid. But the problem is, if you think of graph paper in a grid, it's very rigid. It kind of says, you belong here. Everything is fixed.
And the quilt is already a grid.
And the quilt is a grid. So we thought, how can we have both a grid and a sense of movement? So I'm just going to draw on the top here where it's a little easier to see. I think I can make it. So we did what we call a wavy grid, which is very loose, parallel waves. And these were about 3/8 of an inch apart, and boy, is that badly drawn.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Because I can't see very well what I'm doing. But we did the wavy grid in both directions. And maybe what I'll do here is just draw it a little more nicely in front of myself so you can see this. But this is also wonderful on a domestic machine. You can talk while I draw.
Now, the thing is, when you do the wavy grid, the good news is it's easy. The bad news is basically you're quilting it twice, because you're quilting the entire thing in one direction and then moving it 90 degrees and then quilting it again. However, it really is a fantastic, very beginner-friendly, very domestic machine-friendly way to quilt.
And it kind of gets a fishnet
Sweden's
look.
in the house. We got Sweden and Germany and Brazil and everybody's
Excellent. So what you're getting is this loose fishnet. And the idea of taking a rigid grid, recognizing that our goal was to have a sense of movement, and pulling that out through this extra layer of quilting was all intentional from the get-go. And people will always say, so, you know, you've got these blues. If we look at that original again, we've got a white background. We've got light fabrics, dark fabrics, blue fabrics, red fabrics. What did you quilt it with? And the answer was white thread. Because the white is so fine that even on a dark blue, it disappears pretty much because it's in that valley in the shadow. So it was about the texture and the movement, and yeah.
Mary Pat's asking about, talking about the quilt behind us.
Oh, you recognize that.
We're at our Airbnb in Michigan, and this quilt, which is our picnic quilt, is in the living room here at the cottage. And we did the improvisational wavy, just straight wavy, not a grid.
In one direction.
In one direction, horizontally, with this picnic pattern. The pattern is on our website. We don't have, the kits are all sold out because this is several years old, but you can, you might be able to see, I can't tell, that we just did a really soft waviness that again is kind of the opposite of stitching in the ditch or doing something that responds to the triangles. It's an all over pattern meant to give texture and a nice drape, but there's so much going on with all of these yarn dyes and the triangles and everything that we felt like it didn't need.
It did not need a second grid, a second layer. And the other thing is, we're always looking to respond to the quilt itself. And if you look, this is predominantly, the idea is that there are horizontal bands that are occasionally interrupted, pardon me, by larger triangles. There is not a vertical alignment in the same way here. So it really made more sense to move people across that horizontality. And as Week said earlier, if you do that wavy grid in both directions, it's double the time. Like, you don't need it to hold the quilt together. It's a big commitment do that.
But you can also do it closer to a half an inch apart.
That's
as opposed to 3/8, you know. The question about the curvy quilting on a domestic machine, we've done it both on a domestic machine and on a long arm. I would probably use for the curvy grid, or even just the wavy grid or the waves. I would, if you're doing you're using a domestic machine, I like to have I think of it as like lines on notebook paper that kind of keep your waves in the parallel and kind of neat. So you could absolutely use a walking foot, and that would probably give you just a subtle wave throughout your quilt. If you're doing kind of edge to edge like this, if you were doing that module quilting that I did before, I would do that with dropping the feed dogs.
Mm-hmm. So we have 3 more I think. Do you want to take
No, go ahead.
This you quilted this.
Oh, okay, all right.
No, you get to do it.
So this...
We're both taking quilts that we quilted.
Yeah, this is Blowing in the Wind from Modern Quilts Illustrated #3. And this is an improvisationally pieced quilt that it's a really interesting and fun technique. But there's 3 elements here. There's the gray background, and then there's the white spines, and then there's the yellow elements that are blowing in the wind. You make this quilt in a series of columns. It's really fun and very easy to do. But we felt that each of these elements needed to be handled differently. That white spine that is along the 3 columns is a 1/2 inch wide, and we decided to leave that unquilted, but to go all the way up to the edge. In the same way that I talked about, rather than stitching in the ditch or doing a straight line to outline things, create the edge by turning around. So when I was going in here, for example, rather than, outlining everything, I did a wave here, turned around, a straight line along that white spine, and then a wavy back, just in and out, in and out. So the background gray is wavy, and then the yellows are all very small scale stipples, very small scale. And then the white does not have any quilting on it. I generally don't like to have things unquilted that are bigger than, say, 1/2 inch or so, because it can start to get like wrinkly or sloppy. But in this particular case, we were matching the threads. We were using gray thread and yellow thread, and we didn't want anything on that white. And it wasn't necessary.
Plus, the white is actually brighter when it's unquilted because there's not shadow.
It might even be a 1/4 inch.
I actually think that is.
Yeah, actually, I think it's a 1/4 inch.
No,
it's
like
a 1/2
inch.
inch.
It's a
That's
half
a 1/2
inch.
inch, yeah.
But by leaving it unquilted, you don't get as much shadow, and you have a different texture, so it has a different role. And I mean, sure, we could have quilted it in white, but it was kind of like, if it's only a 1/2 inch finished and you try to quilt it, you're going to have to quilt it so densely that it's going to get stiff, and then everything else will look a little off. And in addition, if your density of quilting is different in different areas, it can pull the quilt, it can distort the quilt. So that's another kind of functional aspect of decisions, trying to keep a consistent density so you don't have unexpected distortion.
So I'm going to just take a quick, because we're getting so many questions here, and I don't want to miss them. Yeah, I don't want to miss them as the scroll goes up. I want to just quickly do a sidebar here about thread.
Great.
So Annette was asking, how would you quilt a quilt with many loud, highly saturated colors? I would use a gray thread. That is similar in value to the loud. So if it's medium, loud, bright colors, I would use a warm gray thread. Probably that would be where I would start.
So I like how Week says probably, because I always say answer a visual question with a visual answer, which is try. Like, if you can sew a little sample.
No, but it is
but
helpful.
In general, yeah.
Where do you start?
I would start with either gray or a desaturated color. Like, we use a fair amount of camel. There's a kind of a tan called Mother Goose by a lot of thread companies. We sometimes...
Latte, Mother Goose,
wheat, baguette. But we also have kind of sometimes sage green can look a little, or these colors can look a little less lifeless. Gray sometimes goes lifeless, especially if it happens to be a very cool gray. So the main thing when choosing the color is just to remember that you're going to be seeing it from a distance, that it's going to be in a slight furrow because there's texture created, that even when you're told to lay one single strand of the thread on top of the quilt, in the end, you're going to see less than that even because it will be tucked into that little valley as it's quilted.
Yeah, so I think, you know, again, this is all taste, and some of our opinions are unpopular. But the thing that we don't ever recommend is variegated thread, because variegated thread, you can't control where the color goes. And if you've got a quilt with a highly saturated palette in it, you've got a lot of visual stimulation going on, and the last thing you need is an irregular pattern of thread as well. So what you want to do is, we always talk about it as being a visual hierarchy. You want something to clearly be the first thing you see, and then the second thing you see. And if you've got a highly saturated palette, my guess is the first thing you're going to notice are the colors. Second thing you're going to notice is the piecing. And the quilting shouldn't be trying to say, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. You know, the quilting should be like, hey, I'm just here to be a supporting actor here. So,
and I think that's really good advice. And with the color, the question that Terry has is, do we always match the bobbin thread to the top thread? No, we don't. And
although most of the time we do.
Right, but we don't always do it. But this is partly, how does your machine behave? If you have tension problems at times where you'll get poked through, then it's probably very important to match the thread, because if you have a light top and a dark back and your thread is light, you don't want lots of white, like light poke through it. It gets tricky because you have to think technically. She'll have opinions, but I also feel that if you have a top and a bottom thread that are similar but not wildly different, that rarely causes any problems.
Okay. I'm raising my hand. So I think I'd like to reframe the question, which is the should the fabric on the back be a consideration for how you're going to quilt the front?
Yes.
I think that is, to me, the question to be asking.
It's an additional question to be asking for sure.
Yeah, I think it precedes that question, because if I in particular dislike darker backings on lighter quilts. I think that invites a whole host of problems in terms of sometimes the darkness of the backing fabric creates a shadow, and it creates problems with selvages and stuff on the front of the quilt. But I think in general, if you don't use the same colors of thread on the front and back, I would encourage you to at least use the same values. So you don't want a dark thread or a light thread on the back and the opposite on the front.
With one exception. Years ago, we, in a book we wrote, we had a quilt called Red Work.
Oh, well, that's totally different.
Totally different.
Totally different.
The front was solid white fabric. The back was solid red fabric. We used white thread on one side, red on the other. And it was just all what do you call it? It was a whole cloth quilt where on one side it was red stitching on white fabric, and on the other side it was white stitching on red fabric.
It was very cool.
So cool. We need to do that again.
Yeah, we should.
it was. I've forgotten about that for years.
So there's one more thread-related question that we got on social media before we started the live stream that I want to add to this discussion, which is that this person understands. So we've covered how to choose a neutral thread, right? This person saying, I know how to choose a neutral thread. How do I choose a thread if I want something to stand out? So that is a totally different set of, guidance there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I would suggest is, again, these are always starting points because your mileage may vary, kind of thing. But I like, if you are thinking about, you want your quilting to show and you want it to add something, I like to go for a lighter value of a color that's in the quilt. So if it's a navy quilt, I might, and I wanted the quilting to show or to highlight part of it, I might go with like a medium blue. I think if you go with both a different hue, so color, right, or a different value, the light or dark, it becomes too disjointed sometimes. There are exceptions.
There are always exceptions.
There are always exceptions. I'm just general guidelines.
One of the big exceptions, or considerations, I should say, is your eyesight. Honestly, if you need to use a slightly more contrasting thread to quilt with so that you can see what you're doing, that's a very good reason to do it. We kind of joke that if you use a thread that blends in, it's really easy to get lost as you're quilting. But if you make a mistake, no one will see it. So if you use something that's highly contrasting, you can see where you're going, but it's not as forgiving. Yeah. So it's definitely tricky that way. And with Mary Pat's question about the mystery quilt, the version we did now, of the hundreds that were done, people had such different approaches. Ours happened to be light and dark. Some people's weren't that way at all. For our backing, oh my gosh, I wish we should have recorded our discussions because it was not quick. Because
you'd think we were like solving
the world's problems. No, it went on for a couple
NATO treaties,
a couple of days. And the thing is, we were talking about three things at once. Four things. How are we going to quilt it? What was the thread color? What was the binding going to be? And what was the backing? And I was actually feeling, Weeks probably doesn't even realize this, but I was feeling kind of smug because I had spent time and I picked out 4 bolts of fabric that I thought would all be good choices. And she kind of took one look and she went over and like, none of the above.
Yeah.
And she, do you remember what you picked? See, this is what's so interesting.
Didn't we go with the gray dominoes?
No.
I can't remember.
See, I love this. I don't remember either.
It was the gray
I think we did
dominoes.
the paisley. The gray dominoes is on the back. That's a different quilt.
Different quilt. Okay. Oh, yeah.
But the answer
the
is
blue
it was
paisley, the navy blue paisley.
It was on the darker side. It wasn't as dark as this, but it was a dark fabric, if I remember correctly, with a medium motif on it. So, when Weeks said she doesn't like a dark backing on a light quilt, in this case, it was a darker backing, but it's not a light quilt. It's a dark and light quilt. So.
But we didn't.
Now I have to. We're not at our studio, so I can't pull it out.
We did change the bobbin on the top, though.
Oh yeah.
We matched the top and back.
And we matched the bottom thread and the bottom back. So
Sandra's asking about thread color for accordion. That is a camel thread. It might look, on your monitor or whatever.
Well,
but it's kind of camel gold. I guess gold maybe.
It was definitely camel, kind of an ochre camel.
Yeah.
And so the accordion quilt, which is on the cover of Modern Quilts Illustrated 11,
yes,
has, I think that version,
which has gained new popularity.
For some reason,
you never know.
There was a huge run on those last week, and we shipped a lot of that issue. Now, that quilt, as we made it, if I remember right, had something like 28 different solids in it, ranging from eggplant to mustard to kind of dusty green. It's a huge range.
Yeah.
And we quilted it in straight lines using this golden camely ochre thread, which was not an immediate decision. This is one where you might think, all these colors, let's go gray. And what we found was that the richness of the quilt kind of called for additional color.
Well, it was a solid. It was a solid quilt, so I felt like
the thread mattered more.
There was one shape, and it was a solid quilt, and I felt like that was a situation in which having that visual hierarchy thing, having additional interest would be welcome because it was just a straight line, and I really. Sometimes
totally her decision.
Yeah, Bill is like, could you make decisions about that? I'm like,
sometimes we have strong opinions about different quilts, but that one.
And I was really nervous, and I remember saying this. I can remember like standing in the studio saying, "Are they going to think that we're just slackers if we do a straight line
on this quilt?"
I'm like, I feel like that's a bold, modern, kind of minimalist, in keeping with the quilt. But are they just going to think we're phoning it in? And because we feel judged too. I mean, I know you all feel judged.
Well, we all
various things.
I think it's a variety of things. Also, I think we really loved the pieced top.
Oh yeah, I didn't want to mess it up.
And we're like, we don't want to mess it up because we're not making it again. We've got too much to do. And so there are rare occasions where I think I've regretted quilting choices I've made, but most of the time we think it through. And again, we have the kind of built-in advantage that we talk things through. Yeah. And I think we catch each other before.
Oh, not always. we gotta get through it.
So let me do one more right now. And I'll go back to Kumihimo.
Okay, so hold on. Did I answer the question about if you want to add interest? So I would go with a lighter value of a color that's in the quilt. However, sometimes, like if you've got, I did a black, I guess it was charcoal and royal blue quilt made out of solids that I quilted with a red thread. Which was really cool.
I forgot about that quilt.
Yeah, and so
that was really beautiful.
So there are times if you've got a really minimalist. I used 2 fabrics, one bold red thread, and that was
straight line quilting.
It was really, it was cool.
It was very cool.
Yeah,
and you need to hang it up somewhere.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of quilts. So.
Yeah, but no, I literally.
But maybe just revisit that idea again. But
it was very cool.
If you really are, you really want to go for it, it's a lot easier to go for it with an interesting thread color if you're not competing with prints. I think or an elaborate, like I wouldn't do that on an Elizabeth Hartman pattern with a whole bunch of animal shapes or something like that.
Yeah, it's always, the quilting needs to work with the design.
Yeah.
And it needs to work with both the fabric and the piecing and with your technical constraints, your setup, your abilities, and that all works together. Yeah. So with our Kumihimo quilt, I'll put this here. So Kumihimo is a Japanese braiding technique that's centuries old. And when we designed this quilt, we were thinking, there's a traditional French braid idea of piecing in Western quilting, but it's usually done as either a border or just kind of this continuous line. The way Kumihimo is done in Japan is you have kind of this wooden donut, and as you make the braid, it drops down and gets longer and longer. It's suspended. And so I love the idea of these different braids being made and being at different states. If you look up close, you'll see that they're very traditional Japanese fabrics, kind of old-fashioned prints. And the background is just a solid tan. So when we looked at this and we wanted to think about the quilting, we were really thinking, okay, we've got this verticality, we've got the diagonals. I'm going to draw on this print. So, do you want me to draw on the black and white version? Okay, I have the black and white.
It's so pretty. Yeah, and then you want to be able to see it. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so here's the black and white. So here, we kind of were channeling a lot of Japanese design thinking. both of us lived in Japan. I only lived there briefly for a year. She lived there for almost a decade. And there's a tradition in Japanese food presentation that you'll see round foods served on a square plate, square foods maybe on a round or triangular plate, where you use one shape to complement and contrast the other. So here, there were a couple things going on. We had the verticality, but we also had the differentiation between prints and solid. So with this, we did continuous line spirals where we kind of go in and back out. Actually, we would have started at the edge.
Yeah.
But they're fairly large spirals, and we did this on a long arm, but you could do it however you want.
You could do it dropping your feet, dogs.
Yeah, and so by going around and around, and these were about 3/8 of an inch apart, what it did was it created movement from side to side, because it's very much like raindrops moving out. It softened the harsher edges of this, but it also became visual interest and beautiful pattern on the solid. Whereas it kind of disappears on these because there's a strong piecing element and there are strong motifs.
The graphic nature of the braids is such that
it dominates.
It dominates in that visual hierarchy. It says like, no, you're looking at me first.
And then when you get down here, you're not bored. Like there's something gentle about this. So it's definitely a working with everything together. And then I'm going to hold this up close because maybe, again, in the printout, it's probably very hard to see. If you, this is in, oh my gosh, I can't remember all our magazines.
I think it's 8.
Maybe issue 8. Again, our pattern finder.
No, 10. It was 10 because that was the Japan issue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's 10. So Lori's asking about liking to quilt organic motifs, leaves, flowers, vines, and how would they complement a more modern quilt. I think just as a general guideline, I always suggest people think about more complex quilting on simpler quilts. And if you've got a very complex quilt, go a little bit more simple. So depending on the scale of your leaves and flowers and vines, and the palette, I think, for example, this quilt, United States of Green, there's a lot going on here. I wouldn't do that sort of thing here, but with that Kumihimo quilt that Bill just held up, which is this one, I think you could do something like that in here.
And I actually, I haven't thought about this a lot before, so I'm just reacting to it. But one of the things about representational motifs, flowers, with people who do programmed quilting, you could have your birthday cake, you could have your teddy bear. It very much can become like a novelty fabric that can become a dominant thing, that you think of the quilt as the one with the teddy bears rather than seeing the piecing.
It's that visual hierarchy thing.
And so if you use a novelty print in a fabric, it immediately becomes the shark fabric or the high heels, the shark quilt or the high heels quilt. Novelty fabrics are immediately recognized and they become part of the way you see it. And it's the same thing. I think the majority of our quilting is more textural and more abstract because we're trying to avoid clear references. Now, we have done floral things at times, but
they're very abstract.
They're more abstract because we like the texture of it, not because we want people to say that's a zinnia. So it's a different way of thinking.
So going to try one more option, just a case to show you, is that module quilting that I did for United States of Green, for New Day.
For New Day, for Mystery Quilt.
I actually developed that kind of strategy quilting United States of Green, and I also did this in modules, except I did them all in the same direction, because this quilt is so much about horizontals and verticals, with the horizontal bands, vertical piecing.
But I do want to clarify, those modules were not the same modules that you see in value here. They were overlapping independent modules.
And much smaller.
Yes.
Yeah. So, one of the questions that we got was about, do you need to both quilt vertically and horizontally? And I'm going to say this slowly to make sure I say it correctly. Quilts shrink even before washing. They shrink in the direction that is perpendicular to stitching. So if you're doing all of your quilting is vertical, as this one was, it will shrink from this direction. So the reason with New Day that I wanted to have horizontals and verticals was in part because I didn't want any shrinking to happen and any odd things, but also just because I didn't want it. It wasn't a vertical quilt in that way.
And if you quilted in one direction, that instead of being a circle, it would be squished into a slight ellipse.
Yeah. And
this issue of shrinkage, I'm glad you brought it up. It's definitely something to think about. In most for most quilts, it's not a big deal, but every now and then precision matters. We had a commission once or twice. We did commissions for 4 poster beds where we wanted the quilt to fit perfectly around those posts at the feet. And we actually had to prototype the density of the quilting, the washing, the shrinkage of the batting to determine the size that the piecing had to be so that once it was quilted, washed, and dried, it would fit and because it was something like, that one, if I remember right, was 6.75%. We had to make the quilt 6.75% larger to get the exact end result. Most of our quilts, they're napping quilts. We curl up on the sofa. I don't care, but sometimes it matters.
In this particular case, this quilt was already plenty wide, so any loss of width wasn't going to be a problem. But I really liked it for quilting in those modules so much more than I would have liked a straight line, because I could change the density of the modules slightly, the quilting within the modules, and it just gave a much more organic feel to it. Now, one thing that's really worth talking about is that if you quilt, whether it's pieced or you're quilting within a pieced area or a background or whatever, if you have huge varying widths between quilting lines in one part of a quilt than you have in another part of the quilt, you may have problems with that quilt lying flat.
Yeah.
And so you can, I think in that Blowing in the Wind, we said we quilted the gray background differently, and then we quilted the yellow elements more densely. They were really similar in density though, because otherwise sometimes the quilt won't lie flat.
Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of physics that comes into it, even if you're not going to wash your quilt. That happens just because of the way the machine and the thread are just pulling into the batting. So the person who asked, is it necessary to have both horizontal and vertical stitching? That is the answer to your question. That you don't necessarily have to, but beware of what stitching only in one direction. For example, this is only in one direction horizontally.
So it shortened the quilt.
Yeah, it shortened the quilt, but we also knew we were going to be hanging it, so it kind of gains gravity. Gives you some space back. But
so I hope this is all helpful in terms of different ways of thinking. And again, I would really encourage you to go and look at the exhibition of the Modern Mystery Quilt, because there's so many great approaches. There are people who quilted concentric circles for that lower orb. About a third of the quilter, because there were multiple options for the final setting, it really affected the way people quilted it. And everyone used different fabrics, different colors. That affects it. So I don't think there are many times where you have that much that you can look at and learn from.
Especially since you've got, very similar quilts you can sort of see how it behaves. One person did ask about that she always ends up with straight lines or wavy lines, and how does she get out of that? And one thing, I think it's really helpful sometimes to see people who have books or, like 15 filler patterns or whatever. And I think that's like a big leap, for some people to like visualize how that's going to go and to master it. And so I would think, like, if you're a beginning quilter or that you're not confident, do what you have done that you're comfortable with, but maybe introduce one element into it. So as you're doing your lines, maybe do one little curly Q and then another little curly Q, or one little kind of like wood grain irregular bump or something like that on every line. So work up to it, because I think it's a lot to say, like, I've only ever done, like stippling or wavy lines, to suddenly you're going to do, very precise hatching or something.
Great advice. Just slowly build up.
Add things in, and make the lines a little bit more irregular. And
the first time you try something different, that first bit of quilting, you will freak out. You'll be like, this isn't right. Wait till you've done a square foot, 2 square feet, and then you stop noticing what seemed like irregularities, because it becomes regularly irregular. So we want you to have fun with your quilting and experiment. So
I would also encourage you to have, whether you want to piece it together from pieces of batting, scraps, or whatever, but have a sample, like kind of a test piece. You don't have to make, experiment with a layered sandwich or several of them.
We do.
And have them available so you can just try something out to see whether you're going to like it, preferably on solid fabric so you can really see what you're doing.
We actually have a whole stack. They almost look like placemats of, usually we take light fabric, dark thread, and do a square foot of a pattern that we're experimenting with. Just cut it, we don't bind it. Sometimes we'll zigzag the edge, but we collect them and we stack them up, because sometimes, it's time to quilt a quilt, and you probably have all been there. You're tired and you're thinking like, oh, I've done the same thing.
First of all, don't quilt when you're tired.
Don't quilt when you're tired. That's better advice. But it's nice to have your own sample library.
It is.
And I personally like that better than just having pictures to look at.
Yeah.
So, build it up. So, anyway.
So, yes.
We'll let you enjoy your April. We won't keep you here all month.
No, but this was such a good topic. And so I'm really, I'm glad people showed up, and there were so many great questions that complemented the ones that we got earlier.
Thank you for those questions. And as always, thanks to Weeks, because she's the one who thinks through the structure.
Plans it.
She plans. I mean, we both do different things. Yeah, I'll get a bunch of printouts, but she's very good at structuring things, and I appreciate that, and I know you all do too.
And we do have more fun things headed your way.
Oh yes.
So I'm
That's
hoping next time we see you, we'll have
some announcements.
Yes, have some announcements for you. So Have a great
We appreciate
Saturday.
you all.
And thank you from all over the world. It's just so humbling to see people from all over the world joining us.
And as I said, this will be up at slightly higher resolution on YouTube. Usually I try to get it up by the end of the day. Fingers crossed.
See you very